Anishinaabe culture is traditionally passed down from generation to generation through songs and stories. But when the Canadian government introduced the Indian Act in 1876 and created residential schools, Indigenous people were barred from practicing their religion and culture, leaving a gap in these oral stories. Thanks to one Saugeen First Nations woman and the help of Museum London, one community is rediscovering its history. Southwestern Ontario Hubs journalist Mary Baxter and I take a closer look at how audio recordings from 80 years ago, which many never knew even existed, are giving voices back to those who were silenced for decades.
I could hear Robert Thompson's voice and I just screamed, "I can hear you!" Tears were streaming down my face. It had been so long waiting for this opportunity.
80 years ago, Saugeen First Nations resident Robert Thompson recorded songs, prayers, and stories that would remain untouched for decades. The scratchy, muffled, and sometimes inaudible recordings are what Bimadashka Pukan had been searching for. 7 years ago, Pukan came across wax cylinders and aluminum disc recordings from 1938. That year, Robert and his wife Eliza Thompson shared Anishinaabe songs and stories with Dr. Edwin Seaborn.
They participated in making these recordings with Dr. Seaborn. Robert Thompson speaks Anishinaabe. He sings songs, he tells some stories, and his wife Eliza then becomes the translator and translates concepts into English for us.
The cylinders and discs were passed through family and eventually donated to Museum London in 1975, where they sat in storage.
These recordings in particular, they sat on a shelf for 80 years. Nobody even knew they were there. Nobody knew the significance of them. And so I didn't want to see a digital file either end up on a digital shelf for the next 80 years. I wanted to see this knowledge become a part of the community again.
The cylinders are made from compact wax and have very fine grooves. They can be read by a dictaphone, but with the cylinders being so old and fragile, there were some hurdles. Of the 8 wax cylinders, 2 had to be repaired before the recordings could be digitized.
We had tried to keep our hopes somewhat realistic, not knowing what we would receive given the age of some of these of the cylinders, and the recording techniques of the past were not quite what we have now.
In partnership with the museum and thanks to grant money, the cylinders were carefully packed and shipped to the U.S., where they were digitized. Anishinaabe culture is passed down to future generations through songs and stories, but the traumas of the 1876 Indian Act and the creation of residential schools barred Indigenous people from practicing their religion or culture and created a gap in these oral stories, making these recordings all the more valuable.
These important things that we're trying to teach young people about citizenship, pride, about identity, a lot of that stuff's missing from the history books, from public education.
Pukan, who also hails from Saugeen First Nation and is an anthropology PhD candidate at Western University, took the audio recordings back to her community.
I was scared. I really was. I was afraid that that maybe people would think I shouldn't be listening to them. I thought maybe people would be angry that finding out that these things had been sitting in a museum for so long.
To hear him from those recordings just kind of really gets to me, because it's like he's reaching from the past, from beyond, and to the present. It's pretty awesome feeling.
Eugene, Bernice, and Harold are all direct relatives of Robert Thompson. He was their great uncle. They say hearing his voice brings mixed emotions.
I can't speak the language, but I can understand it. And that tears me apart.
But members of the Saugeen First Nations community says these recordings are a step towards reconciliation and a step to rediscovering their culture.
We did ceremony. We still do ceremony. The language is there. We still have the language, but we need to reinforce it more. And to bind the gap between the younger generation, the older generation, within all the families. It's really, really important to know who we are. And to have this type of connection, it's just so beautiful.
Poucan's search for what was on the wax cylinders came at a time when she was questioning her identity, but now she's proud of her community. In collaboration with Museum London, part of Saugeen First Nations history is now front and center with the Voices of Chiefs Point exhibit, where the public can also listen to the once forgotten recordings.
Hearing these recordings and hearing Robert Thompson talk about himself, his family, what they'd been through over hundreds and hundreds of years, it showed me that Anishinaabe people are resilient. They are strong. They're adaptable. They're industrious, and they know how to think for themselves.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.